Hello everyone, I'm curious. Where are you tuning in from? What time is it now? It would be great to hear a bit about the different places our community is connecting from around the world. Share where you're watching from and maybe a fun fact about your local area. I'm always excited to learn more about the amazing people who support us. I can't wait to hear your stories. Best regards. I was 17 when this happened, and even now, 3 years later, the memory still makes my hands shake when I hold a rifle. My family lived in a remote cabin in the Colorado Rockies, about 40 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Falls. Dad had been taking me hunting since I was 12, teaching me to track, to shoot, to respect the wilderness that surrounded our home. Those trips were sacred to us, just father and son, away from the distractions of civilization, connecting with something primal and pure. It was October 15th, 2021, when we planned what would become our last hunting trip together. The aspens were turning golden, painting the mountainsides in brilliant yellows and oranges. Dad had been planning this particular expedition for months, targeting a remote area called Devil's Canyon, about 15 miles northeast of our cabin. He'd heard reports of a massive elk herd moving through the area, and the promise of bagging a trophy bull had him more excited than I'd seen him in years. "This is going to be the trip, son," he told me as we loaded our gear into his old Ford pickup. "I can feel it in my bones." Dad was 45 then, a weathered man with calloused hands and eyes that could spot movement in the forest from a quarter-mile away. He worked as a logger during the week, but hunting was his true passion. He knew these mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods, could navigate by landmarks and instinct even when the trails disappeared. The drive to Devil's Canyon took us along increasingly narrow dirt roads, each turn taking us deeper into wilderness that felt untouched by human presence. The last road was barely more than 2 tire tracks through the undergrowth, branches scraping against the truck's windows as we bounced over rocks and fallen logs. As we drove, Dad told me stories about the area, how it got its name from the treacherous ravines that could swallow a man whole, how Native American tribes used to avoid it during certain seasons, claiming the spirits there were restless. I'd always dismissed these tales as local folklore, the kind of stories that grew around any isolated place. But as we descended into the canyon, with its towering pine trees blocking out most of the afternoon sun, I began to understand why people might feel uneasy here. The forest seemed different from our usual hunting grounds, quieter, the normal sounds of wildlife, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush were muted, as if the very air was thick enough to absorb sound. Even our truck engine seemed to run quieter, the rumble of the diesel motor becoming a whisper. When we finally reached our planned camping spot, a small clearing beside a crystal-clear stream, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Long shadows stretched across the ground, and the temperature was dropping fast. Dad parked the truck at the edge of the clearing, and we both climbed out, stretching muscles stiff from the bumpy ride. "Look at this place," Dad said, breathing deeply. "Nothing but wilderness for miles in every direction." He was right. Standing there in that clearing, surrounded by towering evergreens and jagged peaks, I felt the weight of isolation settle over us like a heavy blanket. Our cell phones had lost signal hours ago, and the nearest ranger station was at least 20 miles away on foot. If something went wrong out here, we were truly on our own. But that isolation was also part of the appeal. In a world increasingly connected and crowded, these wild places offered something rare, genuine solitude, the chance to test yourself against nature without safety nets or backup plans. Dad had taught me to see this, not as a threat, but as a gift. As we began unloading our gear, I noticed something that made me pause. The clearing showed signs of previous use, a circle of blackened stones marking an old fire pit, some fallen logs arranged as makeshift benches. But what struck me as odd was how old these signs looked. The fire pit was filled with ash and debris that seemed like it hadn't been disturbed in years, maybe decades. Moss grew over parts of the stone ring, and the logs were rotting and covered in mushrooms. "When was the last time anyone camped here?" I asked Dad. He looked around, frowning slightly. "Hard to say. Could be years. That's what makes this spot so perfect. We've got it all to ourselves. But something about the abandoned campsite bothered me. If this was such a perfect hunting location, why hadn't anyone used it recently? The area should have been popular with hunters, especially during elk season, yet everything suggested the clearing had been untouched for a very long time. I pushed the thought aside and focused on setting up camp. We had a lot of work to do before dark, and the temperature was already dropping. Our breath was beginning to show in small white puffs, and I knew the night would be cold, probably below freezing. We worked efficiently, our movements coordinated by years of camping together. Dad set up our two-man tent, while I gathered firewood and cleared the old fire pit. The familiarity of these tasks was comforting, a reminder that we knew what we were doing out here. We'd camped in conditions far worse than this, had weathered blizzards and thunderstorms in these mountains. As darkness began to creep through the trees, we got our fire going. The flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding forest, creating an island of warmth and light in the growing darkness. We cooked a simple dinner of canned stew and instant coffee, the hot food warming us from the inside out. Sitting by the fire, listening to the crack and pop of burning wood, I began to feel more at ease. This was what hunting trips were supposed to feel like. Peaceful, primal, connected to something larger than ourselves. Dad seemed relaxed, too, leaning back against one of the old logs and staring up at the stars that were beginning to appear between the pine branches. "Tomorrow's going to be a good day," he said quietly. "I can feel it." I nodded, sharing his optimism. We'd planned to start hunting at first light, working our way up the ridge on the far side of the canyon where Dad expected to find elk eye sign. The weather forecast called for clear skies and light winds, perfect hunting conditions. But as I settled into my sleeping bag that night, listening to the sounds of the forest around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond our campfire's reach. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me tense, straining my ears for sounds that didn't belong. I told myself it was just normal hunting nerves, the hyper-awareness that came with being in wild country where predators roamed. Bears, mountain lions, wolves. They were all out there somewhere in the darkness. But this felt different somehow, more personal, as if whatever was watching had intelligence behind its gaze. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my unease, and I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the crackling of our dying fire and Dad's steady breathing beside me. I woke before sunrise, as was my habit on hunting mornings. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and our breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Through the tent walls, I could see the faint gray light of dawn beginning to filter through the forest canopy. Dad was already stirring, and within minutes we were both up, moving with the quiet efficiency of experienced hunters. The morning routine was sacred to us, building up the fire, making coffee, eating a quick breakfast of oatmeal and dried fruit. We spoke in whispers, partly out of habit and partly because the pre-dawn forest seemed to demand silence. Every sound we made, the scrape of a spoon against a metal cup, the rustle of gear being organized, seemed unnaturally loud in the still air. As the sky gradually lightened, the forest around us began to reveal itself in greater detail. In daylight, our campsite looked different, smaller somehow, more vulnerable. The ring of trees that had felt protective in the darkness now seemed to press in on us, their trunks like dark pillars supporting a roof of interwoven branches that blocked out most of the sky. Dad checked his watch, a battered military timepiece that had belonged to his father. "Sun will be up in 20 minutes, he whispered. "We should head out soon." We finished our coffee in silence, then began the process of preparing for the hunt. Rifles were cleaned and loaded, ammunition checked and counted. We dressed in layers, thermal underwear, wool shirts, insulated jackets, waterproof outer shells. Our boots were treated leather, broken in over years of use, with aggressive treads for gripping on steep terrain. Dad spread out his topographical map on a flat rock, weighing down the corners with stones. The paper was laminated and marked with pencil notations from previous hunts, a record of successful spots and promising areas. He pointed to a ridgeline about 2 miles northeast of our camp. "We'll work our way up this drainage," he said, tracing a route with his finger. "Should intersect with game trails right about here. If we don't find fresh sign by noon, we'll circle back and try the south face." I studied the map, memorizing landmarks and escape routes. Dad had taught me to always know where I was in relation to camp, to never venture into country without understanding how to get back out. The topography here was complex. Steep ridges separated by narrow valleys, with numerous side canyons that could confuse even experienced outdoorsmen. As we shouldered our packs and checked our gear one final time, I noticed something that made me pause. Along the tree line at the edge of our clearing, about 50 yards from our tent, I could see what looked like deep scratches in the bark of several large pines. The marks were too high to have been made by any animal I was familiar with, at least 8 feet off the ground, and they appeared fresh, the exposed wood still pale and unscarred by weather.
"Dad,"
I said quietly, pointing toward the trees. "Look at those marks." He followed my gaze, squinting in the dim light. After a moment, he shrugged. "Probably bears marking territory. Big grizzly can reach pretty high when he wants to." But something about the scratches bothered me. They were too regular, too deliberate, and they formed a pattern. 3 parallel gouges, about 6 inches apart, repeated on tree after tree along the perimeter of our clearing. It looked less like territorial marking and more like I couldn't put my finger on what it reminded me of. "Should we be worried?" I asked. Dad considered this, then shook his head. "Bears avoid humans if they can. Making noise, keeping a clean camp, that's usually enough. Besides, he patted the .45 pistol on his hip. We've got protection if we need it." We set off into the forest, just as the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate the canopy, creating shafts of golden light that illuminated particles of dust and pollen floating in the air. The forest floor was carpeted with pine needles and fallen leaves that muffled our footsteps, and the air was clean and sharp, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. The trail we followed was barely visible, little more than a game path worn by deer and elk over countless seasons. It wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, occasionally opening into small meadows where we could see patches of sky. Dad moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades in these mountains, reading the subtle signs that marked our route: broken branches, disturbed earth, the way certain trees leaned in response to prevailing winds. We'd been walking for about an hour when we encountered the first sign that something was wrong. In a muddy section of trail beside a small stream, we found tracks, boot prints in the soft earth, but unlike any I'd ever seen. They were huge, at least size 15, but shaped wrong somehow. The heel was too narrow, the toe area too wide, and there was something odd about the stride length that made my skin crawl. Dad knelt beside the tracks, studying them intently. "Hunter maybe," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Big guy." "When do you think these were made?" I asked. "Hard to say. Could be yesterday, could be last week. Ground's been soft since the rain." But as we continued up the trail, we found more tracks, and they all told the same disturbing story. Someone or something had been moving through this area recently, and whoever it was had been following the same route we were now taking. The tracks appeared at regular intervals, always in the muddiest spots where they would show clearly, as if they'd been deliberately placed for us to find. The pattern of the stride bothered me more than anything else. It was too long for a normal human gait, suggesting either someone extraordinarily tall or something that moved in a fundamentally different way than people did. And there was something about the depth of the impressions that suggested enormous weight, far more than even a large man should carry. We reached the ridgeline around mid-morning, emerging from the dense forest onto a rocky outcropping that provided a commanding view of the valley below. The sight was breathtaking, miles of unbroken wilderness stretching to the horizon, with snow-capped peaks rising in the distance like ancient sentinels. But the beauty of the scene was overshadowed by what we found at the edge of the overlook. Someone had been here before us, and recently, the evidence was unmistakable. A small fire pit built from loose stones, still containing cold ashes. Nearby, we found the remains of what might have been a meal, bones scattered around the fire, picked clean and cracked open. But these weren't the remains of normal camp food. The bones were too large, too thick, and they'd been broken in ways that suggested incredible strength. "What do you think killed this?" I asked, holding up what looked like a femur from a large animal. Dad examined the bone, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Could be a bear kill, or maybe wolves." But we both knew that wasn't right. The bones showed no tooth marks, no signs of being gnawed by scavengers. Instead, they looked like they'd been deliberately broken, the marrow extracted with surgical precision, and the sheer number of bones suggested an animal much larger than anything that lived in these mountains. Elk, maybe, but bigger than any elk I'd ever seen. We spent several minutes examining the site, trying to piece together what had happened here. The fire had burned hot enough to crack some of the stones in the ring. Whoever had built it had known what they were doing, had taken time to construct it properly. But why build a fire on this exposed ridge, where it could be seen for miles? As we prepared to leave the overlook and continue our hunt, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Carved into a nearby aspen tree, about 7 feet off the ground, was a symbol I'd never seen before, a complex pattern of intersecting lines that seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at it directly. The carving was fresh, the bark around it still weeping sap, and it had been cut deep into the wood with something incredibly sharp. "Dad?" I called softly. "You need to see this." He joined me at the tree, staring up at the symbol with growing alarm. Neither of us could identify what it meant, but there was something inherently disturbing about its design, something that made us both want to look away. "We should head back," Dad said quietly. "Something's not right here." For the first time since we'd arrived in Devil's Canyon, I heard uncertainty in his voice. Dad was not a man easily shaken. He'd faced charging bears, survived blizzards, navigated treacherous terrain in conditions that would have killed less experienced outdoorsmen. But something about this place, about the accumulating evidence that we weren't alone, had gotten under his skin. As we made our way back down the ridge, retracing our steps toward camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide a lurking presence. Every sound made me jump and spin around, rifle ready. The forest that had seemed so peaceful at dawn now felt hostile, alien, as if we'd stumbled into territory where humans weren't welcome. The descent should have taken us an hour, but we made it in 45 minutes. Our pace quickened by growing unease. When our campsite came into view through the trees, we both felt a surge of relief. The familiar sight of our tent, the cold fire pit, the truck parked at the edge of the clearing, these things represented safety, civilization, a connection to the world we understood. But as we approached the camp, Dad suddenly stopped, holding up his hand for silence. Something was wrong. I followed his gaze and felt my heart skip a beat. Our campsite had been visited while we were gone. The evidence of intrusion was subtle but unmistakable to eyes trained in wilderness awareness. Our tent, which we'd left securely zipped and properly staked, now showed signs of examination. The rainfly was slightly askew, pulled away from the tent body in a way that suggested someone had lifted it to peer underneath. More disturbing, the zipper pulls hung at different positions than we'd left them, small details that might escape a casual observer. But Dad and I had developed habits of precision over years of camping in country where attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. "Stay alert," Dad whispered, unshoulder his rifle and working the bolt to chamber around. Could still be around. We approached our campsite with the caution of soldiers entering hostile territory, moving from tree to tree, using cover, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. Our truck appeared untouched, still parked where we'd left it, keys hidden in the magnetic box under the rear bumper. But our gear told a different story. The camp chairs we'd positioned around the fire pit had been moved, not dramatically, but enough to create a different arrangement than the neat semicircle we'd established the night before. One chair was turned completely around, facing away from the fire toward the darkness of the surrounding forest, as if someone had sat there watching the tree line for hours. Our food supplies, stored in a locked metal bear box, remained secure, but the box itself had been moved several feet from its original position. Given that the container weighed nearly 50 pounds when loaded, this suggested either multiple people or someone of extraordinary strength. More disturbing, we found clear handprints in the dirt around the box, prints that matched the strange tracks we'd discovered on the trail. "What the hell is going on here?" I muttered, kneeling beside the bear box to examine the prints more closely. The handprints were human in basic structure, but wrong in proportion. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow, and the thumb seemed to extend at an unnatural angle. Most unsettling, the prints pressed deep into the hard-packed earth, suggesting hands that had gripped with incredible force. Dad was conducting his own examination of the campsite, moving in careful circles, reading the ground like a book. His face grew increasingly grim as he discovered more evidence of nocturnal visitors. Boot prints circled our tent multiple times, suggesting someone had walked around our shelter repeatedly while we slept. The thought made my skin crawl. We'd been unconscious and vulnerable, while unknown intruders moved freely through our camp. "How many?" I asked. "Hard to say. Maybe one person, maybe more." Whoever it was knew how to move quietly. Most of these prints are in soft spots where they'd show clearly, but I'm not finding much sign in the harder ground. This observation was particularly disturbing. It suggested our visitors weren't simply curious campers or lost hikers, but individuals skilled in wilderness craft, people who understood how to move through the forest without leaving unnecessary evidence. The selective placement of clear prints almost seemed deliberate, as if they wanted us to know they'd been here. We spent the next hour systematically searching the area around our camp, expanding our search in concentric circles. What we found painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The mysterious visitors had been thorough in their reconnaissance, examining every aspect of our presence in the canyon. They'd approached our truck, leaving faint scratches on the paint where they'd tested the door handles. They'd investigated our fire pit, stirring through the cold ashes with what appeared to be a stick or branch. Most alarming, we found evidence that they'd watched us from concealment. About 70 yards from our camp, hidden in a dense thicket of pine saplings, we discovered accrued blind branches, arranged to create a viewing position with clear sight lines to our tent and fire pit. The ground showed signs of prolonged occupation, with compressed vegetation and several cigarette butts scattered around the position. The cigarette butts were a revelation, proof that we were dealing with human intruders rather than animals. But they raised as many questions as they answered. The brand was unfamiliar, hand-rolled rather than manufactured, and they had an odd smell when Dad examined them. Not tobacco, but something earthier, more organic. "Local Indians, maybe," I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew it sounded weak. Dad shook his head. "Native tribes around here don't use this area for hunting, haven't for generations. Besides, this doesn't feel like traditional activity." He was right. There was something fundamentally wrong about the evidence we were uncovering, something that suggested purposes we couldn't understand. The methodical examination of our camp, the deliberate placement of clear tracks, the hidden observation post, it all suggested planning and intelligence, but directed toward goals that remained opaque. As we continued our search, the forest around us seemed to grow more oppressive. Clouds had moved in while we'd been investigating, blocking out the sun and casting everything in gray shadow. The temperature was dropping, and a wind had picked up, causing the trees to creak and sway in ways that created constant movement in our peripheral vision. We found the final piece of evidence about 100 yards north of our camp, in a small clearing beside the stream where we'd collected water the night before. Someone had constructed what could only be described as a shrine, a careful arrangement of animal bones, stones, and organic materials that formed a complex pattern on the ground. At the center of the arrangement sat a human skull, bleached white and obviously old, its empty sockets seeming to stare directly toward our campsite. The skull was the most disturbing element, not just because of what it represented, but because of its condition. It showed no signs of trauma, no bullet holes or impact damage that might suggest an accidental death. Instead, it appeared to have been carefully cleaned and preserved, treated with something that had given the bone an almost translucent quality. "We need to leave," Dad said quietly, staring at the grotesque arrangement. Right now. I couldn't have agreed more. Whatever was happening in Devil's Canyon, we'd stumbled into something far beyond our understanding or ability to handle. The shrine represented a level of deliberate malevolence that made my hands shake as I shouldered my rifle. We returned to camp and began breaking down our gear with urgent efficiency. There was no discussion of continuing our hunt, no debate about whether we were overreacting. The accumulated evidence had crossed a line from merely unsettling to genuinely threatening, and both of us recognized that our safety depended on immediate departure. As we worked to pack our equipment, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, expecting to see figures watching us from the shadows. The sensation of being observed had grown stronger throughout the morning, becoming an almost physical pressure that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "How long do you think they've been watching us?" I asked as we collapsed the tent. "Could be since we arrived," Dad replied grimly. "Maybe longer. That fire pit at the overlook, what if they knew we were coming? What if they've been tracking us since we left home?" The thought was terrifying, suggesting a level of premeditation that transformed our situation from an unfortunate encounter with local weirdos into something far more sinister. If we'd been targeted specifically, if our movements had been monitored and predicted, then we might be walking into a trap by leaving the relative security of our campsite. But staying was clearly not an option. Whatever the risks of departure, they paled in comparison to the certainty that remaining in Devil's Canyon would expose us to dangers we couldn't even identify, let alone defend against. We loaded our gear into the truck with record speed, our movements sharp and efficient despite the adrenaline coursing through our systems. Dad performed a quick mechanical check, oil, coolant, tire pressure, fuel level, while I secured our equipment in the truck bed. Everything had to be perfect. Breaking down on the remote roads leading out of the canyon would leave us stranded and vulnerable. As Dad started the engine, I took one last look at our campsite. In daylight, it looked innocent enough, just another clearing in an endless forest, marked only by an old fire pit and some trampled vegetation. But I knew I'd never forget the feeling of menace that had grown around this place, the sense that we'd been tolerated as temporary visitors in territory belonging to something else entirely. The truck roared to life, its diesel engine sounding unnaturally loud in the mountain stillness. As we pulled away from the clearing, I found myself hoping that our departure would end whatever interest our mysterious watchers had taken in us. But deep down, I suspected that leaving Devil's Canyon would not be as simple as driving away. The forest seemed to press in around us as we navigated the narrow dirt road, branches scraping against the truck's windows like grasping fingers. And somewhere in the rearview mirror, I could swear I saw movement among the trees, dark shapes that might have been shadows, or might have been something else entirely, following our departure with interest that felt anything but benign. The dirt road out of Devil's Canyon proved more treacherous than our inbound journey, partly due to our haste and partly because something fundamental had changed about the landscape itself. Features I remembered from the drive in distinctive rock formations, fallen trees, even the shape of certain curves seemed different now, as if the forest had rearranged itself while we slept. Dad noticed it too, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter as we navigated turns that should have been familiar but felt foreign. "This doesn't look right," he muttered, slowing the truck to a crawl as we approached what should have been a straightforward section of road. What we found instead was a deliberate obstruction. Someone had dragged fallen trees across the track, creating a barrier that would force any vehicle to stop. The logs were massive, ancient pines that would have required heavy equipment or multiple people to move, yet they'd been positioned with precision, creating narrow gaps that allowed foot traffic but made vehicular passage impossible. "Roadblock," Dad said grimly, putting the truck in park, planned and deliberate. We sat in the idling truck for several minutes, studying the obstruction and the forest around it. The trees created perfect cover for an ambush, their thick trunks and low-hanging branches providing countless hiding spots for anyone who might be watching our approach. Yet we saw no movement, heard no sounds beyond the natural whisper of wind through pine needles. "What do you think?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad checked his sidearm, then reached behind the seat for his rifle. "We clear the road, fast and careful. You watch the tree line while I move the logs." But as we climbed out of the truck, we discovered that clearing the road wouldn't be as simple as we'd hoped. The logs weren't just blocking our path. They'd been deliberately secured in place with heavy gauge wire, twisted tight around anchor points driven deep into the ground. Someone had invested significant time and effort in making this barrier as permanent as possible. More disturbing, we found evidence that we weren't the first travelers to encounter this obstruction. Hidden among the trees beside the road were the rusted remains of an older vehicle, a pickup truck that looked like it had been abandoned for years. Its tires were flat, its windows spider-webbed with cracks, and vegetation was beginning to reclaim its body. But most unsettling was the driver's door, which hung open as if the occupant had left in great haste. "Jesus," I breathed, approaching the abandoned truck. "How long has this been here?" Dad joined me, his expression grim as he examined the vehicle. The license plate was too corroded to read, but the truck's design suggested it was at least 20 years old. Inside we found personal effects scattered across the seats, a thermos, some maps, a hunting license from 1998 made out to someone named Vernon Kowalski. "Dad," I said, pointing to something that made my skin crawl. "Look at the windshield." The glass was covered in scratches, not random damage from years of weathering, but deliberate marks that formed the same disturbing symbol we'd seen carved into the tree at the overlook. The scratches had been made from inside the vehicle, as if the driver had clawed at the glass in desperation, trying to mark something important before what? We found our answer in the truck bed, hidden under a tarp that had somehow survived decades of mountain weather. Scattered across the metal surface were dozens of bones, human bones, sorted and arranged with the same methodical precision we'd seen in the shrine near our campsite. Among them, we found a wallet containing Vernon Kowalski's identification, a photo of a smiling family, and a note written in increasingly erratic handwriting. Dad read the note aloud, his voice barely steady. "They're everywhere, watching, following, can't leave, road blocked, God help me, they're not human. If someone finds this, don't come looking, run, get out while you still can." The message was dated September 15, 1998, over 20 years ago. Vernon Kowalski had encountered the same mysterious presence we'd discovered, but unlike us, he'd never made it out of Devil's Canyon. The implications were terrifying. How many other hunters, campers, hikers had disappeared in this remote area over the years? How many vehicles lay hidden in the forest, their occupants reduced to carefully arranged bone collections? "We're walking out," Dad said quietly, folding the note and putting it in his pocket. "Right now." I wanted to argue, to suggest we could find another route or somehow clear the roadblock, but the evidence before us made such hopes seem naive. Whatever controlled this territory had been operating for decades, perfecting methods for trapping and disposing of intruders. Our truck would only slow us down, make us easier targets. We grabbed essential gear from the vehicle, water, first aid kit, map and compass, ammunition, and began the long hike out of the canyon. The main road was 12 miles away, all of it through increasingly difficult terrain. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a challenging but manageable day hike, but these were far from normal circumstances. As we set off on foot, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The forest around us was completely silent. No birds sang in the trees, no squirrels chattered warnings, no insects buzzed in the underbrush. It was as if every living creature had fled the area, leaving only an oppressive quiet that seemed to muffle even our own footsteps. We'd been walking for about an hour when we encountered the first antler. It was mounted on a broken tree branch at head height, positioned directly beside the trail where it couldn't be missed. The antler was massive, from a bull elk that must have been enormous in life, but it had been modified somehow, sharpened into points and carved with the same disturbing symbols we'd seen elsewhere. "Warning marker," Dad said grimly. "Territory boundary." But, as we continued along the trail, we found more antlers. They appeared at regular intervals, each one larger and more elaborately modified than the last. Some had been bleached white, others painted with what looked like dried blood. All of them bore carved symbols that seemed to twist and writhe when viewed directly, making my eyes water and my head pound. The antlers were clearly meant to intimidate, to mark territory and warn away intruders, but they also served another purpose. They were leading us somewhere. The trail of antlers curved away from the direct route out of the canyon, guiding travelers toward some unknown destination deeper in the wilderness. "We're not following their breadcrumbs," Dad said firmly. "We stick to the game trail, head straight for the main road." But as we tried to maintain our chosen route, we discovered that the forest itself had become our enemy. Trails we'd followed on the way in had vanished, replaced by impenetrable thickets of thorny undergrowth. Streams we'd crossed easily now ran too deep and fast to ford safely. Even the topography seemed different, with ridges and valleys that didn't match Dad's carefully annotated maps. It was as if the landscape was actively working against us, forcing us toward the antler trail, whether we wanted to follow it or not. Every alternate route we attempted led to dead ends, cliff faces, or terrain too dangerous to navigate. The antlers beckoned from the one path that remained open, their carved symbols seeming to pulse with malevolent invitation. "They're herding us," I realized with growing horror, "like cattle to slaughter." Dad nodded grimly, checking his rifle for the dozenth time. "Question is, do we let them drive us where they want to go, or do we make our stand here?" The choice was impossible. Following the antler trail meant walking into whatever trap had been prepared for us, but attempting to bushwhack through the hostile terrain would exhaust our strength and leave us vulnerable to attack when we were weakest. We were being given an illusion of choice while being maneuvered toward a predetermined outcome. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, we made our decision. We would follow the antler trail, but on our terms. Dad took point, rifle ready, while I covered our rear. We moved slowly, carefully, studying every tree, every shadow, every potential ambush site. If we were walking into a trap, we would at least go in prepared to fight. The antlers led us deeper into the canyon, through terrain that grew increasingly surreal and threatening. The trees here were different, older, more gnarled, their branches forming unnatural patterns that hurt to look at directly. The very air seemed thicker, charged with a malevolent energy that made our skin crawl and our hearts race. And always, we felt the sensation of being watched, not the casual observation of wildlife, but the focused attention of intelligent beings studying our every move, analyzing our strengths and weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The antler trail was leading us somewhere specific, and with each step, I became more certain that we would not like what we found at its end. The antler trail led us through increasingly alien terrain, where the familiar rules of mountain ecology seemed suspended. Trees grew in perfect circles around bare patches of earth, their branches intertwining overhead to form natural cathedrals that blocked out the sky. Flowers bloomed out of season, their colors too bright, too intense, like drops of neon paint scattered across the forest floor. Even the rocks seemed wrong, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence, but followed no geometry I could understand. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows between the trees, we reached what could only be described as an amphitheater. The forest opened into a natural bowl carved from the mountainside, its walls lined with towering pines that formed perfect sightlines to a flat area at the center. The space felt ancient, sacred, like a place where significant events had unfolded for centuries. At the center of the clearing stood a structure that made my breath catch in my throat. It was built from bones, thousands of them, arranged in complex geometric patterns that rose nearly 20 feet into the air. Human skulls formed decorative elements at key points, their empty sockets seeming to track our movement as we approached. The entire construction was held together with sinew and wire, creating a monument to death that dwarfed anything we'd encountered so far. "God Almighty," Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. "What is this place?" The bone structure wasn't random. It had been carefully planned and executed by someone with both architectural knowledge and unlimited access to human remains. The base was a perfect circle, with spokes radiating outward like the points of a compass. Vertical elements rose at calculated intervals, connected by horizontal beams that formed complex patterns when viewed from different angles. But it was the smell that truly revealed the horror of what we discovered. The air was thick with the stench of decay, not the clean decomposition of natural death, but something fouler, more deliberate. Hidden among the bones were fresher remains, strips of meat, organs, things that had been carefully preserved and displayed as offerings or warnings. We approached the structure with extreme caution, rifles ready, every instinct screaming at us to turn and run, but fascination overcame fear as we began to understand the true scope of what we were seeing. This wasn't the work of a single disturbed individual. It represented decades of systematic collection, organization, and construction. Someone or some group had been killing in these mountains for a very long time. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a section of the bone monument where skulls had been arranged according to size. They're sorted, organized by age. Dad joined me, his face pale as he studied the grisly display. The smallest skulls were clearly children, arranged in neat rows like a macabre inventory. Adults were separated by gender, with male and female remains forming distinct sections of the structure. The organization was methodical, scientific, suggesting minds that approached murder with the same systematic precision others might apply to building a house. As we circled the bone monument, we discovered that each section was marked with symbols carved into strategically placed femurs and tibias, the same twisted designs we'd seen throughout the canyon, but here they were more elaborate, formed into something approaching a written language. Someone had been keeping records, documenting their work with the pride of craftsmen. "We need to document this," Dad said, pulling out his phone despite knowing we had no signal. "Police are going to need evidence." He began taking photographs, capturing the structure from multiple angles while I stood guard. The click of the camera shutter seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence of the clearing, and I found myself wincing with each shot, certain the sound would draw unwanted attention. That's when I saw them. At first, they were just shadows moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing, dark shapes that might have been branches swaying in the wind. But as my eyes adjusted to the gathering dusk, I began to make out human figures, tall, impossibly thin. They moved with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural, their limbs bending at angles that suggested either extreme flexibility or broken bones. "Dad," I whispered urgently, "we've got company." He looked up from his photography, following my gaze to the tree line. What he saw made him freeze, the camera hanging forgotten in his hands. They were emerging from the forest now, stepping into the fading light of the clearing with the confidence of predators in their own territory. There were 7 of them, arranged in a loose semicircle that would soon surround our position. In the dim light, it was difficult to make out details, but what I could see made my stomach churn. They wore clothing of some kind, but it hung in tatters from frames that seemed stretched beyond normal human proportions. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their movements suggested a familiarity with the bone monument that was deeply disturbing. The tallest figure, clearly the leader, raised one elongated arm and pointed directly at us. When it spoke, its voice carried clearly across the clearing. Despite the obvious distance, a sound like wind through dry leaves formed into something approaching human speech. "Visitors," it said. The word stretched and distorted until it barely resembled language. "Welcome to our cathedral." Dad raised his rifle, sighting on the leader's center mass.
"Stay back," he shouted. "We're armed."
The response was laughter, a sound like breaking glass that seemed to come from all directions at once. The figures began to move, closing the circle around us, with deliberate patience. They weren't rushing, weren't showing any fear of our weapons. Instead, they moved with the confidence of beings who had performed this ritual many times before. "Weapons are useless here," the leader continued, its voice growing stronger as it approached. "This is sacred ground, consecrated by blood. Your blood will join the foundation." I could see them more clearly now, and what I saw defied rational explanation. They had once been human, that much was clear from their basic anatomy, but something had changed them, stretched them, twisted them into forms that retained human intelligence while abandoning human limitations. Their fingers ended in claws that looked sharp enough to cut steel, and their teeth had been filed into points that gleamed wetly in the dying light. "The canyon chooses who may leave," another voice called from the shadows. "The canyon has not chosen you." They were close enough now that I could smell them, a mixture of decay and something else, something chemical that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. It was the smell of preservation, of bodies that had been treated with substances that prevented normal decomposition while allowing consciousness to persist. Dad fired a warning shot into the air, the rifle's report echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. For a moment the figures paused, but rather than retreating, they seemed amused by the display. "Noise," the leader observed. "How delightfully primitive." That's when I realized the true horror of our situation. These weren't wild animals or deranged humans operating on instinct. They were intelligent, organized, and completely confident in their ability to handle any resistance we might offer. They had been doing this for decades, perfecting their methods, learning from each encounter. We weren't their first armed visitors, and we certainly wouldn't be their last. "Run," Dad said quietly, never taking his eyes off the approaching figures. "On 3, head for the trees on the north side. I'll cover you." "I'm not leaving you," I replied, though my voice shook with terror. "You'll do as I say," he said firmly. "Someone needs to get out, needs to tell people what's happening here. That's you." The figures were less than 50 yards away now, moving with that same fluid grace that defied normal human locomotion. In the gathering darkness, their pale skin seemed to glow with phosphorescent light, and their eyes reflected what little starlight penetrated the forest canopy. 1. Dad counted quietly. I gripped my rifle tighter, knowing that running would likely mean abandoning him to a fate too horrible to contemplate. But staying would mean both of us becoming additions to their bone cathedral, our remains carefully sorted and incorporated into their grotesque monument. 2. The leader raised its hand again, and the other figures stopped their advance. For a moment, the clearing was frozen in tableau, predators and prey facing each other across ground consecrated by decades of murder. 3. The moment Dad shouted 3, everything erupted into chaos. I broke left toward the tree line, while Dad opened fire on the approaching figures, his rifle cracking repeatedly in the confined space of the amphitheater. The muzzle flashes lit up the clearing in stark, strobing light, revealing glimpses of our pursuers that my mind struggled to process. They moved unlike anything human, flowing between the gunshots with liquid grace, their elongated limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. Dad's shots were finding targets. I could see the impact of bullets striking flesh, but the figures absorbed the damage without slowing, dark fluid streaming from wounds that should have been fatal. "Go, go, go," Dad shouted, working the bolt of his rifle to chamber fresh rounds. I reached the tree line just as the first of our pursuers closed with Dad. Even from 30 yards away, I could hear the sound of claws on metal as it tried to tear the rifle from his hands. He rolled away, drawing his sidearm and firing point-blank into the creature's torso. The .45 caliber bullets punched through its body with wet, tearing sounds, but still it kept coming. Part of me wanted to turn back, to help him fight, but Dad's final order had been clear. Someone had to escape, had to carry word of what was happening in Devil's Canyon to the outside world. If I died here, all evidence of this place would die with us. I plunged into the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I ran through undergrowth that seemed designed to slow and entangle. Behind me, the sounds of combat continued. Gunshots, inhuman screams, and Dad's voice shouting challenges that grew increasingly desperate. The forest at night was a maze of shadows and obstacles, every root and branch a potential trap for running feet. I had no flashlight, relying instead on what little starlight filtered through the canopy to navigate the treacherous terrain. My rifle slowed me down, but I couldn't bring myself to abandon it. It might be the only thing standing between me and the same fate that had befallen Vernon Kowalski. I'd been running for maybe 10 minutes when I realized the gunfire had stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound of battle, because it suggested that Dad's resistance had been overcome. The thought hit me like a physical blow, sending me stumbling against a tree trunk where I fought down the urge to vomit. They would be coming for me now. Whatever those things were, they wouldn't be content with a single victim. The Bone Cathedral suggested they were collectors, gatherers who took pride in completing their sets. As long as I remained free, their work would be unfinished. I forced myself to start moving again, trying to remember Dad's lessons about wilderness navigation. Without compass or map, my only reliable guide was the slope of the terrain. Water flowed downhill, and following water would eventually lead to larger streams, then rivers, then roads. But in the darkness, even identifying slope was difficult, and I found myself repeatedly climbing when I should have been descending. The forest around me felt alive with malevolent intelligence. Every shadow could hide a pursuer. Every sound might herald an attack. I tried to move quietly, but panic made stealth impossible. Branches cracked under my feet, leaves rustled with my passage, and my own breathing seemed loud enough to attract attention from miles away. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I heard them behind me. Not the crashing passage of human pursuers, but something far more terrifying, the soft whisper of movement through undergrowth, barely audible but getting steadily closer. They were tracking me, following my trail with the patience of experienced hunters who knew their prey couldn't escape. I tried to increase my pace, but the terrain was becoming more difficult. The slope was steepening, broken by ravines and rocky outcroppings that forced me to detour repeatedly. Each change of direction might be taking me further from safety, deeper into the wilderness that was their domain. A sound ahead made me freeze, the distinctive crack of a breaking branch. I dropped to a crouch behind a fallen log, rifle ready, trying to control my breathing as I strained to identify the source of the noise. For several minutes, nothing moved. Then I saw it. One of the pale figures was standing less than 20 feet away, perfectly motionless between two large pine trees. In the darkness, it was barely visible, but its unnatural stillness marked it as clearly foreign to the forest environment. It was waiting, watching, testing my nerves. I remained frozen behind the log, knowing that any movement would trigger an attack. My rifle was loaded and ready, but Dad's experience had shown that conventional weapons were of limited effectiveness against these creatures. Still, it was the only advantage I possessed. Minutes passed in tense silence. My legs began to cramp from the awkward position, and I knew I couldn't maintain this standoff indefinitely. Worse, where there was one pursuer, there were likely others. I might be sitting in the center of a trap, surrounded by creatures waiting for me to reveal my position. The decision was made for me when I heard movement to my left, another figure approaching through the undergrowth. In seconds I would be caught between them, with no room to maneuver and nowhere to run. I had to act. I rose from behind the log and fired at the nearest figure, working the bolt rapidly to chamber a fresh round. The bullet struck center mass, spinning the creature around but not dropping it. It released a scream that sounded like tearing metal, then launched itself toward my position with inhuman speed. I fired again, this shot taking it in the head and finally dropping it to the forest floor. But the sound of gunfire had given away my position to every predator in the area, and I could hear them converging on my location from multiple directions. I ran. The next hour became a nightmare of flight through hostile terrain, pursued by enemies who seemed to know the forest better than any human could. They herded me like wolves hunting deer, appearing at strategic points to cut off escape routes, forcing me to move in directions they chose. I was being driven somewhere specific, toward some predetermined destination. My ammunition was running low, only a handful of rounds remained in my rifle, with perhaps a dozen more in my jacket pockets. At the rate I was encountering pursuers, I would be defenseless within minutes. But still I ran, driven by the desperate hope that I might reach help before my resources were exhausted. The forest began to thin as I climbed higher into the mountains, the dense pine stands giving way to rocky terrain dotted with stunted trees. The change in environment offered both advantages and disadvantages: better visibility but less cover, easier movement but nowhere to hide. It was in this rocky landscape that I made my final stand. I reached the edge of a cliff just as dawn began to break over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gray that barely illuminated the nightmare landscape below. Behind me, the rocky face dropped away into darkness, a fall that would certainly be fatal. Ahead, the pale figures emerged from the tree line with the confidence of predators who had cornered their prey. There were 5 of them now, moving with that same fluid grace that defied human anatomy. In the growing light, I could see them more clearly than ever before, and the sight made my hands shake as I raised my rifle. They had once been human, that much was undeniable, but something had transformed them into creatures that retained intelligence while abandoning humanity. Their skin was translucent, revealing the dark network of veins beneath. Their limbs were elongated beyond normal proportions, joints bending at angles that should have been impossible. Most disturbing were their faces, which retained enough human features to be recognizable while being utterly alien in expression. Their eyes were completely black, reflecting light like polished obsidian, and their mouths were filled with teeth that had been filed into sharp points. "End of the trail," the leader said, its voice carrying clearly across the rocky ground. "Nowhere left to run." I backed against the cliff face, rifle trained on the nearest figure. "What do you want?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. "What we have always wanted," it replied. "What the canyon demands. Blood for the foundation, bone for the cathedral." They began to spread out, moving to flank my position. I had perhaps 3 rounds left in my rifle, with maybe 8 more in my pocket. Against 5 opponents who had demonstrated resistance to conventional weapons, the mathematics were hopeless. "Your father fought well," another voice added, with what might have been admiration. "His strength was impressive. His bones will hold a place of honor in our construction." The mention of Dad sent rage coursing through my system, temporarily overwhelming the fear that had been driving me through the night. These things had killed him, had added his remains to their grotesque monument, and they were speaking of it like some kind of honor. "You murdered him," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "We transformed him," the leader corrected. "As we will transform you. Death is only the beginning of service to the canyon." They were close enough now that I could smell them, that mixture of decay and chemical preservation that had marked them from our first encounter. Up close, their unnatural nature was even more apparent. These weren't living beings in any sense I understood, but something that existed in the space between life and death. I fired my first shot at the leader, the bullet striking it in the chest and staggering it backward. Dark fluid sprayed from the wound, but within seconds, the creature was advancing again, the hole in its torso already beginning to close. "Futile," it observed. "We are beyond such simple harm." My second shot took another figure in the head, dropping it to the rocky ground. But even as it fell, I could see movement in the wound, tissue beginning to knit itself back together with unnatural speed. The third shot went wide, as the remaining figures rushed my position simultaneously. I had time to chamber one more round before the first creature reached me, its clawed hands grasping for my throat. I fired point blank into its face, the muzzle flash searing my own eyes. The impact destroyed most of its head, sending it tumbling backward, but the others kept coming. I swung the rifle like a club, the steel stock connecting with bone and flesh that felt wrong under the impact. Claws raked across my jacket, tearing through the heavy fabric and scoring the skin beneath. I rolled away from the cliff edge, using the rifle's length to keep some distance between myself and my attackers, but they were faster, stronger, and completely without fear. One of them grabbed the rifle barrel, its superhuman strength threatening to tear the weapon from my hands. I held on desperately, using the creature's grip to pull myself closer before driving my knee into what I hoped was a vulnerable area. The impact sent it staggering, but others were closing in from different angles. That's when I heard the helicopter. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the sounds of combat, but it grew steadily stronger. Someone was coming, rescue, or at least witnesses to what was happening in Devil's Canyon. The pale figures heard it too, their black eyes turning skyward with what might have been concern. "Impossible," the leader hissed, its voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "No one comes to the canyon. No one finds this place unless we allow it." But the helicopter was definitely real, its rotor noise echoing off the canyon walls as it approached our position. I used the distraction to break free from my attackers, scrambling across the rocky ground toward a position where I might be visible from the air. The pale figures seemed uncertain for the first time since our encounter began. They moved with less coordination, their attention divided between me and the approaching aircraft. Whatever power they wielded in Devil's Canyon, it apparently didn't extend to controlling the outside world's intrusion into their territory. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the emergency whistle Dad had insisted I carry, a device designed to signal rescue aircraft. The shrill blast cut through the morning air, hopefully loud enough to guide the helicopter to our exact location. The response was immediate. The helicopter changed course, swinging toward the cliff where I stood. Below its cockpit, I could see the distinctive markings of the Colorado State Patrol, and hanging from its side was rescue equipment that suggested this wasn't a routine flight. The pale figures were retreating now, moving back toward the tree line with obvious reluctance. Whatever they were, whatever power had sustained them in the depths of the canyon, they apparently couldn't operate openly in the presence of official witnesses. "This isn't over," the leader called as it reached the edge of the forest. "The canyon remembers. The canyon always remembers." Then they were gone, vanishing into the forest with the same fluid grace that had marked their approach. Within seconds, it was as if they had never existed, leaving me alone on the rocky ground, with my torn clothes and empty rifle as the only evidence of what had transpired. The helicopter circled twice before finding a place to land on a relatively flat section of the cliff. 2 state troopers emerged, followed by a medic who immediately began checking me for injuries. Their questions came in rapid succession. Who was I? How had I gotten here? Where were the other members of my party? I tried to explain, but even as I spoke, I could hear how insane my story sounded. Pale creatures that absorbed bullet wounds, bone cathedrals built from decades of murders. My father killed defending our escape. It was the stuff of nightmares, not police reports. "Son," one of the troopers said gently, "you've been through something traumatic. Sometimes the mind creates explanations for things we can't understand." But they took me seriously enough to organize a search, calling in additional aircraft and ground teams to scour Devil's Canyon for evidence of what I'd described. What they found was enough to launch one of the largest criminal investigations in Colorado history. The search teams found our abandoned truck first, still parked beside the roadblock that had forced us to continue on foot. The barrier itself was exactly as I'd described, massive logs secured with heavy wire, positioned to trap vehicles while allowing foot traffic to pass. But it was what they discovered in the surrounding forest that transformed my account from the ravings of a traumatized teenager into the foundation of a federal investigation. Vernon Kowalski's truck, with its cargo of carefully arranged bones, provided the first concrete evidence that something terrible had been happening in Devil's Canyon for decades. The forensic team that examined the remains confirmed that they were human, representing at least 15 different individuals of various ages. More disturbing, several of the bones showed signs of deliberate modification, carving, sharpening, and treatment with preservatives that prevented normal decomposition. The search for Dad's body led them to the bone cathedral I described, though what they found was far worse than even my traumatized account had suggested. The structure was massive, constructed from the remains of dozens of victims accumulated over what the forensic anthropologists estimated to be at least 30 years. Hidden chambers within the construction contained preserved organs, clothing, and personal effects that told the stories of people who had vanished without a trace. But of Dad himself, they found no sign. His rifle was discovered near the cathedral, along with spent brass casings and blood evidence that confirmed a firefight had taken place. Yet his body was nowhere to be found, leading investigators to conclude that he had either been taken alive or his remains had been removed for purposes they didn't want to contemplate. The pale figures I'd described were never found, despite extensive searches using thermal imaging, tracking dogs, and ground-penetrating radar. The forest showed signs of recent habitation, cave systems that had been modified for human occupation, underground chambers stocked with preserved food and primitive tools. But whoever had been living in Devil's Canyon had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. The official investigation lasted 8 months, involving multiple federal agencies and forensic experts from around the country. What they uncovered painted a picture of systematic predation stretching back generations, a cult or clan of individuals who had claimed Devil's Canyon as their territory and eliminated anyone who intruded upon it. DNA evidence recovered from the Bone Cathedral identified victims from across the western United States, people who had disappeared while camping, hunting, or hiking in remote areas. Missing persons cases, dating back to the 1970s, were suddenly connected to the horrors found in that isolated canyon, providing closure for families who had spent decades wondering about the fate of their loved ones. But many questions remained unanswered. Who were the perpetrators? How had they evaded detection for so long? Most importantly, where had they gone, and would they strike again elsewhere? I spent 3 weeks in a Denver hospital, recovering from exposure, dehydration, and the psychological trauma of what I'd witnessed. The doctors were amazed that I'd survived at all, given the conditions I'd endured and the distance I'd covered on foot. But they had no explanation for some of the evidence I'd brought out with me. Scratches on my jacket that showed no sign of tearing, as if the fabric had been cut with blades sharper than any known tool. The media attention was overwhelming. My story became national news, spawning documentaries, books, and countless internet theories about what had really happened in Devil's Canyon, most focused on the human perpetrators, treating the case as an extreme example of cult behavior in isolated areas. Few gave credence to my descriptions of the pale figures and their unnatural abilities. I didn't blame them. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I wouldn't have believed it either. Mom and I moved away from Colorado 6 months later, unable to live in the shadow of the mountains that had taken Dad from us. We settled in suburban Kansas, about as far from wilderness as we could get, while remaining in the continental United States. I finished high school there, went to college, got a job in information technology that kept me firmly in the world of concrete and steel. But I never forgot what I'd seen in Devil's Canyon, and I never stopped watching the news for signs that they might have returned. Over the years, there have been occasional reports that caught my attention: hikers disappearing in remote areas, campsites found abandoned with no explanation, bone arrangements discovered in places where they didn't belong. Each time, I contacted the investigating authorities, sharing what I knew about the methods and patterns I'd observed. Most dismissed me as a crank, someone whose traumatic experience had left him seeing connections where none existed. A few took me seriously enough to follow up, but none ever found evidence as conclusive as what had been discovered in Devil's Canyon. The area itself was closed to public access indefinitely, declared a crime scene, and then later a research site for federal agencies studying cult behavior and organized predation. Guard posts were established at all known access points, and regular patrols were instituted to ensure that no one could return to continue the work that had been interrupted. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever those pale figures were, whatever power had sustained them for decades in that remote canyon, it couldn't be contained by government barriers and warning signs. They were patient, intelligent, and completely committed to their cause. They would wait, adapt, and eventually find another place to continue their work. 3 years have passed since that October morning when Dad and I drove into Devil's Canyon, expecting nothing more than a successful hunting trip. I'm 20 now, working in a climate-controlled office building, surrounded by millions of people, about as far from the wilderness as a person can get. But every night when I close my eyes, I'm back on that cliff face, watching pale figures emerge from the forest with predatory grace. This happened to me during the spring of 2021, when I was 19 years old and trapped in what felt like an endless cycle of pandemic restrictions. The world had been locked down for over a year, and our small town of Cedar Falls felt more isolated than ever. School had been a mixture of virtual classes and sporadic in-person sessions, but by late May, most of us had completed our coursework early. The administration basically told us that if we had finished our requirements, we didn't need to show up for the remaining weeks. Freedom, in the limited sense that existed during those times, finally felt within reach. My group of friends had been going stir-crazy for months. We'd exhausted every video game, binged every series worth watching, and had grown tired of the endless video calls that had replaced real human interaction. The only activity that remained consistently available to us was fishing. It was outdoors, socially distanced by nature, and gave us something to focus on besides the suffocating atmosphere of constant uncertainty that had dominated our lives. Every morning at exactly 6 a.m., the six of us would meet up. Trevor, who had somehow managed to keep his beat-up Honda Pilot running, despite his father's predictions of imminent breakdown, would pick up the rest of us, since we all lived within a few blocks of each other in the Riverside neighborhood. The routine had become sacred to us. Tyler and Jordan from Maple Street, Ben and Drew from Oak Avenue, and myself from the corner house on Pine Road. Our destination was always the same, Miller's Pond, a decent-sized body of water about 15 minutes from town that consistently yielded trout and bass. The fishing wasn't spectacular, but it was reliable, and there was a small bait shop just 2 minutes away, where old Pete would sell us night crawlers and occasionally share stories about the good old days when you could catch fish the size of small dogs from that very pond. The repetition had become comforting. In a world where everything felt uncertain and dangerous, where we couldn't hug our grandparents or eat inside restaurants, this simple routine anchored us. We'd cast our lines, talk about nothing and everything, and for a few hours pretend that the world made sense again. But by early June, even our beloved routine had started to feel stale. We'd mapped every inch of Miller's Pond, knew exactly where the base liked to hide during different times of day, and could predict with frightening accuracy which spots would be productive. Tyler had started bringing a book instead of focusing on fishing. Jordan spent more time skipping rocks than casting his line. We all felt it, the need for something new, something different. That's when Trevor mentioned the app. FishBrain had been downloaded on Trevor's phone for months, but he'd never really explored its full potential. It was designed to be a social network for anglers, where people could log their catches, share photos, and most importantly for us, mark productive fishing spots with detailed information about what species were being caught and when. On our final official day of school, while we sat around Miller's Pond, catching nothing but the same small bluegill we'd been pulling out for weeks, Trevor started scrolling through the app's map feature. His eyes lit up as he zoomed in on areas within a reasonable driving distance. "Look at this," he said, turning his phone screen toward us. "There's a creek system about 30 minutes north that people are saying is incredible for trout, Rainbow Brook, and apparently some brown trout too." The location markers showed consistent catches over the past several weeks. Photos of beautiful rainbow trout with vivid pink stripes, brook trout with their distinctive speckled patterns, and even a few impressive brown trout that looked like they belonged in a fishing magazine rather than a small creek in our area. "Says here the access is a bit of a hike," Trevor continued, reading the details. "About 4 miles of trail to reach the best spots, but look at these fish." He scrolled through photo after photo. These weren't the small, somewhat disappointing fish we'd been catching at Miller's Pond. These were the kind of trout that made fishing feel like an adventure, rather than just a way to pass time. Ben leaned over to get a better look. 4 miles isn't that bad. We've hiked further than that before. "Yeah, but look at what some of these people are saying about the terrain," Drew pointed out, reading over Trevor's shoulder. "Multiple elevation changes, some steep sections, and apparently you need to cross the creek several times to access different pools." That actually made it sound more appealing to me. I'd been fly fishing for 3 years, ever since my uncle had taught me during a trip to Colorado, and I was getting tired of casting into the same predictable spots. The idea of technical fishing in varied terrain, where different techniques might be required for different sections of the creek, sounded exactly like what we needed. "The app shows that the best fishing is early morning," Tyler observed. "So we'd need to start even earlier to account for the drive and hike." We spent the next hour planning. The logistics were more complex than our usual routine, but not impossibly so. Trevor would pick everyone up at 5:30 a.m. instead of 6. We'd need to pack more supplies, since we'd be hiking for several hours, and wouldn't have the convenience of Pete's bait shop nearby. Most importantly, we'd need to let our parents know we'd be going to a new location and would likely be out of cell phone range for most of the day. The more we talked about it, the more excited we became. This felt like the first real adventure we'd had in over a year. Everything else in our lives had become so controlled, so limited, so predictable. The idea of exploring somewhere new, somewhere that might actually challenge us, felt like stepping back into a version of ourselves we'd almost forgotten existed. "Let's do it tomorrow," I suggested. "It's supposed to be clear and cool in the morning, perfect fishing weather." Everyone agreed immediately. We spent the rest of the afternoon gathering information about the location, studying the trail maps available online, and planning what gear to bring. I decided I'd pack both my fly rod for the shallow areas where I could work on my technique, and my spinning rod for the deeper pools where the bigger fish would likely be waiting. That night, I had trouble falling asleep, not because I was worried, but because I was genuinely excited for the first time in months. I kept thinking about the photos we'd seen on the app, imagining myself working my way up that creek, reading the water, adapting my technique to new challenges. I had no idea that within 24 hours, fishing would be the furthest thing from my mind. Trevor's Honda Pilot rumbled to life at 5:25 a.m., cutting through the pre-dawn silence of our neighborhood. The early June air was crisp and carried the scent of dew-covered grass and the faint aroma of someone's coffee brewing somewhere nearby. I had packed my gear the night before: fly rod, spinning rod, tackle box organized with various flies and lures, a day pack with water and snacks, and my camera to document what I hoped would be our best fishing trip yet. The others emerged from their houses like zombies, still half asleep, but carrying their gear with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this routine dozens of times before. Tyler clutched a large coffee mug and moved with the deliberate slowness of someone not quite ready to be awake. Jordan had his lucky fishing hat pulled low over his eyes and carried what looked like enough tackle to stock a small sporting goods store. "Everyone ready for an adventure?" Trevor asked with the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to convince himself he was fully awake. A chorus of mumbled agreement came from the group as we loaded our gear into the back of the Pilot. The drive would take us northwest, away from town and into areas I'd rarely explored. According to the GPS, our destination was a trailhead parking area that served multiple hiking trails, including the one that would take us to the creek system we'd studied on Fishbrain. As we drove, the familiar landscape of our town gradually gave way to more rural areas. Subdivisions became farmland, strip malls became scattered houses with large yards, and streetlights became increasingly rare. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the rolling hills and creating a golden glow that made everything look more beautiful than it had any right to. According to the app, the best fishing is in the first 2 hours after sunrise, Ben said, scrolling through his phone. "So timing should be perfect." "What's the plan when we get there?" Drew asked. "Are we sticking together or splitting up like usual?" That was a good question. At Miller's Pond, we'd developed a system where we'd break into 2 groups of 3, cover different areas, and meet back up around noon to compare our catches and share stories. The new location was larger and more complex, with multiple pools and runs spread out over several miles of creek. "I think we should stick together for the first part," I suggested. "At least until we get a feel for the area and figure out where the fish are. After that, maybe we split up into smaller groups but stay within shouting distance." The GPS announced that we'd arrived at our destination just as we spotted a small gravel parking area on the left side of the road. It was more primitive than I'd expected. Just a cleared area with space for maybe 8 or 10 cars, a wooden sign marking the trailhead, and a small information board with a basic map of the trail system. We were the only vehicle there. "Guess we're the early birds today," Tyler observed, as we unloaded our gear. The trailhead sign indicated that our destination, marked as Whispering Creek Access, was 3.8 miles via the Blue Blaze Trail. The estimated hiking time was listed as 2 to 3 hours, depending on fitness level and weather conditions. A warning at the bottom of the sign mentioned that the trail crossed the creek multiple times and could be slippery when wet. Creek crossings, Jordan said, adjusting his backpack straps. Good thing I brought the waterproof boots. We set off just as the sun cleared the horizon, following blue blazes painted on trees at regular intervals. The trail started easy enough, a well-maintained dirt path that wound gently upward through mixed hardwood forest. The morning air was filled with bird songs I couldn't identify, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the faint sound of running water. After about 20 minutes of hiking, we encountered our first creek crossing. The water was shallow, but moving fast, flowing over smooth rocks that looked treacherous. A fallen log served as a makeshift bridge, but it was narrow and didn't look particularly stable. I'm not trusting that log with my gear, Ben said, eyeing the crossing skeptically. Rock hopping it is, Trevor decided, pointing to a series of larger stones that provided a more stable path across the water. We made it across without incident, though Tyler managed to get one boot wet when a rock shifted under his weight. The trail continued on the other side, climbing more steeply now and leading us deeper into the forest. The second crossing came after another 30 minutes of hiking. This time the creek was wider and deeper, and there was no convenient log. The trail simply disappeared into the water on one side and picked up again on the opposite bank. This is where the real fishing starts, I said, studying the pool that had formed just upstream from the crossing. The water was crystal clear, and I could see what looked like the shadows of fish holding in the deeper sections. We crossed more carefully this time, taking our time to ensure our gear stayed dry. The water was shockingly cold even through my boots, and the current was stronger than it had appeared from the bank. By the time we reached what the trail map indicated was the main fishing area, we'd been hiking for just over an hour. The forest had grown denser around us, and the sound of the creek had become a constant background presence. We were now following the water more closely, with the trail sometimes running right alongside the bank and sometimes cutting inland to avoid particularly rough terrain. "This is it," Trevor announced, consulting his phone and the FishBrain app. "According to the GPS, we're right in the middle of the area where people have been catching those big trout." The creek in front of us looked like something from a fishing magazine. Clear water flowed over a series of granite shelves, creating multiple pools of varying depths. Overhanging trees provided cover and dropped insects into the water, while submerged logs and boulders created the kind of structure that trout love to hide behind. "This is incredible," Jordan said, already starting to assemble his rod. "I can see why people hike all the way up here." We found a flat area near the bank where we could spread out our gear and get organized. The plan was to start fishing here and work our way upstream, hitting different pools and runs as we went. We'd stay in visual contact with each other, but spread out enough that we wouldn't interfere with each other's fishing. I was in the process of rigging my fly rod when Tyler suddenly stopped what he was doing and tilted his head to one side. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of confusion. We all stopped and listened. At first, all I could hear was the sound of water flowing over rocks and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then, faintly, from somewhere upstream, came the sound of something moving through the undergrowth. "Probably just a deer," Ben said, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. The sound came again, closer this time. Not the delicate stepping of a deer, but something heavier, more deliberate. Something that seemed to be moving parallel to the creek, staying just out of sight in the dense forest. "Maybe we should have picked a busier trail," Drew muttered, glancing around nervously. But the sound faded away, and after a few minutes of listening to nothing but natural forest noises, we convinced ourselves it really had been just a deer or some other harmless wildlife. We were in their territory, after all, and it made sense that our presence might have disturbed some of the local animals. I went back to rigging my fly rod, selecting a small dry fly that might tempt any trout feeding on the surface. The morning was shaping up to be perfect for fishing, overcast enough to keep the fish active, but with enough light to see what we were doing. I had no way of knowing that something in the woods was watching us, learning our voices, and waiting for the right moment to use what it had learned. The fishing started off exactly as we'd hoped. Tyler, working a deep pool about 50 yards downstream from our starting point, landed a beautiful rainbow trout within the first 15 minutes. Jordan had connected with something substantial in a run beneath an overhanging tree, though he lost it when his line got tangled in the branches. Ben and Drew had moved upstream and were methodically working their way through a series of smaller pools, while Trevor stayed near our gear and focused on a promising eddy where the current created a perfect feeding lane. I had waded out into the creek itself, working my fly rod in the shallow areas where I could see trout rising to take insects off the surface. The water was so clear that I could watch the fish react to my fly, adjusting my technique based on their behavior. It was technical, engaging fishing that required complete focus, exactly what I'd been craving after months of predictable fishing at Miller's Pond. For the first hour, everything was perfect. The creek lived up to every positive review we'd read on FishBrain. The fish were active, the scenery was spectacular, and the challenge of reading new water and adapting our techniques kept all of us engaged and excited. Then the sound started. It began as something subtle, just the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves from somewhere in the forest around us. At first, none of us paid much attention. We were in the middle of wilderness area after all, and the presence of wildlife was not only expected, but part of the appeal. Deer, squirrels, birds, maybe even black bears, all of these were common in the region, and the sounds we were hearing seemed consistent with normal animal activity. But as the morning progressed, the disturbances became more frequent and seemed to follow a pattern that was increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidental. I was in the middle of working a particularly promising pool when I heard what sounded like footsteps in the forest behind me. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the scurrying of smaller animals, but the deliberate, measured pace of something large moving through the undergrowth. I paused my casting and turned to look, but the forest was too dense to see more than 20 or 30 feet in any direction. "Hey, Tyler," I called out. "You moving around up there?" "No, I'm still in the same spot," he replied from downstream. "Why?" "Just thought I heard someone walking around behind us." "Probably just a deer. They're everywhere up here." That explanation satisfied me for the moment, and I went back to fishing. But over the next 30 minutes, the sounds continued and began to take on characteristics that were harder to explain away as normal wildlife activity. The footsteps seemed to move in parallel with us as we worked our way upstream. When we stopped, they stopped. When we moved to a new location, they resumed. It was as if something was following our progress along the creek, staying just out of sight, but maintaining a constant distance. "Are you guys hearing this too?" Jordan asked during a brief break in the fishing action. He was looking nervously at the tree line, his rod forgotten in his hands. "The footsteps," Ben replied. "Yeah, I've been hearing them for the last 20 minutes. It's weird how they seem to match our movement." "Animals do that sometimes," Drew said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They're curious about humans. Maybe it's just trying to figure out what we are." But even as he said it, we all knew that the explanation didn't quite fit what we were experiencing. The sounds were too consistent, too deliberate, too clearly focused on our location. Wild animals might be curious about human presence, but they typically either approached for a closer look or moved away to avoid contact. They didn't typically maintain a steady, parallel course for extended periods. Trevor, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "There's something else. I've been watching for game trails and other signs of animal activity, and I'm not seeing much. No deer tracks, no scat, no browsing damage on the vegetation. For an area that's supposed to have a lot of wildlife, it's surprisingly empty." That observation sent a new chill through the group. Trevor had grown up hunting with his father and knew how to read the signs of animal presence in the forest. If he was saying that the normal indicators of wildlife weren't there, it meant that either the animals had learned to avoid this area for some reason, or something had caused them to relocate. "Maybe we're overthinking this," I suggested, though I didn't really believe it myself. "Let's just stick together a little closer and keep fishing. We came here to catch trout, and the fishing has been amazing." We tried to return to our normal routine, but the atmosphere had changed. Where before we had been relaxed and focused on the technical aspects of fishing, Now we found ourselves constantly glancing over our shoulders and listening for sounds that might not belong. The jokes and casual conversation that usually accompanied our fishing trips had been replaced by a tense awareness of our surroundings. The sounds in the forest continued, sometimes fading away for 10 or 15 minutes at a time, before resuming with renewed intensity. It was during one of these quiet periods that we heard something that made all of us stop what we were doing and look at each other with genuine alarm. From somewhere upstream, maybe 200 yards away, came the unmistakable sound of a human voice. It was faint and indistinct, more like the cadence and rhythm of human speech than actual words we could understand. But there was no mistaking it for any kind of natural sound. Someone else was in the forest with us, and they were close enough that we could hear them talking. "Did you guys hear that?" Ben asked unnecessarily. We had all heard it. "Should we go check it out?" Tyler suggested. "Maybe it's other hikers who got lost or need help." But even as he said it, something about the voice didn't seem right. It was too regular, too repetitive, like someone reciting the same words over and over again. And there was only one voice, no conversation, no indication of multiple people, just that single steady stream of incomprehensible speech. "Let's give it a few minutes," I decided. "If there are other hikers, they'll either move on or come this way eventually. If they need help, they'll call out more clearly." We waited, listening intently, but the voice faded away without coming any closer. For the next half hour, the forest around us was quieter than it had been all morning. Even the normal bird songs seemed muted, as if the entire ecosystem was holding back and waiting for something to happen. It was during this period of unnatural quiet that the real horror began. The voice, when it came back, was different. Instead of the indistinct murmuring we'd heard earlier, this time the words were clear, recognizable, and absolutely terrifying. "Guys, come here." It was Ben's voice, perfect in every detail. The same tone, the same inflection, even the same slight accent that came from growing up in our small town. But Ben was standing right next to me, his face gone pale as he heard his own voice calling to us from somewhere deep in the forest. We all froze. Tyler's rod slipped from his hands and clattered against the rocks. Jordan took an involuntary step backward, nearly losing his footing on the slippery creek bottom. Drew grabbed onto Trevor's arm, as if to confirm that what we were hearing was really happening. "That wasn't me," Ben whispered, though his statement was completely unnecessary. We could all see him standing there, mouth slightly open in shock, staring in the direction the voice had come from. "Guys, come here," the voice repeated, identical to the first time. Same words, same intonation, like a recording being played back. "What the hell is that?" Tyler managed to ask, his voice barely audible. None of us had an answer. The logical part of my brain was scrambling for explanations. Cell phone audio, some kind of electronic device, maybe even other hikers playing a cruel prank. But the voice had been too perfect, too exact. It wasn't just someone doing an impression of Ben's voice. It was Ben's voice, captured and repeated with impossible precision. "We need to get out of here," Drew said, already starting to pack up his gear with shaky hands. But before any of us could respond, the voice came again. This time it was Trevor's voice, calling from a completely different direction. Lincoln heard himself too. The words made no sense. There was no Lincoln in our group, but the voice was unmistakably Trevor's. Same vocal patterns, same slight rasp that came from years of seasonal allergies. Trevor himself was standing 3 feet away from me, his face a mask of confusion and growing fear. "How is this possible?" he asked, but his question was answered immediately by the sound of his own voice echoing back from the forest. "How is this possible?" That's when I realized what was happening, and the understanding hit me like a physical blow. Something in the forest was listening to us, learning our voices, and playing them back, not just mimicking the sound, but capturing and reproducing our exact speech patterns with perfect accuracy. "Everyone shut up," I hissed. "Don't say anything else." We stood in complete silence for several minutes, barely breathing, listening to the forest around us. The normal sounds of running water and rustling leaves seemed amplified in the absence of human speech. But underneath those natural sounds, I could swear I heard something else, a subtle scratching or scraping, like something moving through the undergrowth, while trying to remain quiet. Then Jordan's voice came from upstream. "We need to get out of here." The exact words Drew had spoken moments before, but in Jordan's voice. Perfect reproduction, perfect timing, like something had been waiting for the right moment to demonstrate that it had been listening to everything we said. That broke our resolve to remain silent. Drew started shoving gear into his backpack with frantic energy. Tyler began breaking down his rod with hands that shook so badly he could barely manage the simple task. Ben kept looking around the forest as if he expected to see something emerge from the trees at any moment. "We're leaving," Trevor announced in a voice that was trying to sound authoritative but came out high and strained. "Right now, everyone pack up everything and we're going back to the car." But as soon as he said it, we heard the words repeated from multiple directions around us. "We're leaving. Right now. Everyone pack up everything and we're going back to the car." First in Trevor's voice from upstream, then in Ben's voice from across the creek, then in my own voice from somewhere behind us. The same words, spoken in perfect reproduction of our own speech patterns, coming from locations that would be impossible for any normal person to reach in the time that had elapsed. The forest around us had become an echo chamber of our own voices, all speaking words we had actually said, but coming from directions where none of us were standing. "Move," I said, shouldering my pack and starting toward the trail. "Don't talk, just move." We half ran, half stumbled back toward the first creek crossing, abandoning any pretense of normal hiking pace. Behind us, our own voices continued to echo through the forest. "Move. Don't talk. Just move." What the hell is that? We need to get out of here. How is this possible? The voices followed us as we made our way along the trail, always staying just out of sight, but maintaining a constant presence. Sometimes multiple voices would speak at once, creating a surreal chorus of our own words, spoken back to us from the darkness between the trees. At the first creek crossing, Tyler slipped on the wet rocks and went down hard, soaking himself up to the waist in the frigid water. Normally, this would have been the source of jokes and laughter from the rest of us. Instead, we hauled him up and kept moving, driven by a terror that none of us completely understood but all of us felt with absolute certainty. "Tyler's hurt," came Jordan's voice from somewhere behind us. "We should help him." But Jordan was right next to me, and Tyler was already back on his feet and moving. The voice was trying to get us to stop, to turn around, to go back toward whatever was speaking with our voices. We kept moving. The trail back seemed longer than it had during our morning hike, every turn revealing more forest that stretched endlessly ahead of us. Our pace had settled into a fast walk rather than the panicked run we'd started with, but the tension in the group was increasing rather than decreasing as we put distance between ourselves and the creek. The voices had stopped following us after we crossed the second creek, but somehow their absence was more disturbing than their presence had been. At least when we could hear them, we knew where the threat was located. Now we were hiking through forest that felt completely hostile, knowing that something was out there, but having no way to track its location or intentions. Tyler's fall into the creek had left him soaked and shivering, despite the relatively warm morning temperature. His teeth were chattering, and he kept stumbling on sections of trail that should have been easy to navigate. The combination of cold and adrenaline was taking a toll on his coordination and judgment. "We need to stop and get Tyler warmed up," Drew said during a brief pause to check our location on the trail map. "No," Tyler replied immediately. "I'm fine. Let's just get back to the car." But even as he said it, his voice came echoing back from the forest around us. "I'm fine. Let's just get back to the car." Not Tyler's current voice, strained and shaky from cold and fear, but his normal voice from earlier in the morning when he had been relaxed and confident. The thing in the forest was still with us, still listening, still learning. "It followed us," Ben said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. Those words, too, were immediately echoed back from multiple directions. It followed us. We resumed hiking with renewed urgency, but now the forest itself seemed to be working against us. Branches that I didn't remember from the morning hike caught at our backpacks and fishing rods. Rocks that had been stable on our way in now shifted underfoot, threatening to send us tumbling. The trail itself seemed less clear, with blue blazes that appeared to be missing or faded in crucial locations. "Are we on the right trail?" Jordan asked, consulting his phone and finding no GPS signal. "Are we on the right trail?" came the immediate response from somewhere ahead of us. But this time, the voice wasn't quite right. It was Jordan's voice, but there was something mechanical about it, as if it were being played through a speaker rather than spoken by a human throat. The mimicry was becoming less perfect, more obviously artificial. "It's getting worse at copying us," I observed. "It's getting worse at copying us," came the reply, but this time in multiple voices simultaneously, a horrifying chorus of our own speech patterns layered on top of each other until they became almost unintelligible. That's when I realized what was happening. The thing in the forest wasn't just learning our voices, it was learning how to use them. What had started as simple repetition was evolving into something more complex and more threatening. It was beginning to experiment with combinations of our words, trying to create new sentences from the vocabulary it had collected. "Don't say anything else," I warned the group. "It's learning from everything we say." But the warning came too late. Our voices began speaking from the forest around us, in combinations we had never used. "Tyler's hurt. How is this possible? We need to get out. Are we on the right trail? Everyone pack up. Don't say anything else." The sentences were grammatically correct, but contextually wrong, like someone learning a language from a textbook, but not understanding how the words were actually supposed to fit together. The effect was deeply unsettling, creating a sense that something alien was attempting to understand human communication and failing in ways that revealed its fundamental otherness. We reached the halfway point of our return hike, a small clearing where the trail split to accommodate hikers heading to different destinations, and paused to regroup. Tyler was in bad shape, his lips slightly blue, and his coordination noticeably impaired. Drew was checking his phone obsessively, hoping for cell signal that never appeared. Ben and Jordan kept looking back the way we had come, as if expecting to see something pursuing us through the trees. "How much further?" Trevor asked, consulting the trail map. The question was answered not by any of us, but by a voice from the forest that sounded like a combination of all our voices speaking at once. "How much further to the car where Tyler needs help because it followed us?" The sentence structure was wrong, the word choice was wrong, but the meaning was clear enough to send a new wave of terror through our group. Whatever was speaking had been listening to everything we'd said throughout the morning, and was now trying to create new communications from the pieces it had collected. More disturbing was the implication that it knew our destination. It had somehow determined that we were heading to a car, and it seemed to understand that Tyler was in distress. This wasn't just mimicry, it was analysis and comprehension. 2 miles, I said, reading the trail marker and immediately regretting giving it new words to work with. 2 miles to help Tyler get warm where the car is waiting for us, came the response from multiple directions, the voice shifting between different members of our group mid-sentence. We started moving again, but now every step felt like we were walking deeper into a trap. The thing in the forest wasn't just following us, it was hurting us, learning our patterns, and possibly preparing for something we couldn't anticipate. The trail began to descend more steeply as we approached the final section before the parking area. This should have been encouraging. We were getting close to our destination and to the safety of civilization. Instead, it felt like we were walking into the lowest point of a funnel, with whatever was hunting us positioned above and around us. "I can see the parking area," Trevor announced as we rounded a bend that opened up into a view of the gravel lot where we'd left the Honda Pilot. "I can see the parking area where we left the car this morning before hiking to catch trout in the creek," came the immediate response, but this time the voice seemed to be coming from the direction of the parking lot itself. It was waiting for us at our destination. The Honda Pilot sat exactly where we had left it, appearing completely normal in the late morning sunlight, The gravel parking area was still empty, except for our vehicle, and everything looked precisely as it had when we'd arrived, full of excitement and anticipation just a few hours earlier. But now the sight of our car filled me with dread rather than relief. If the voice was coming from the direction of the parking lot, then whatever was mimicking us had either moved ahead of our position or had never been behind us at all. The implications of either possibility were terrifying. "It could be between us and the car," Drew said, voicing what we were all thinking. "It could be between us and the car," echoed our own voices from the forest around the parking area. We stopped at the edge of the tree line, 50 yards from the vehicle, trying to assess the situation. The parking area was open ground with no cover. If we made a run for the car, we'd be completely exposed for the entire distance. But staying in the forest meant remaining in the territory of whatever was hunting us. "Keys," Trevor said, patting his pockets. "Where are my keys?" He went through every pocket twice, his movements becoming increasingly frantic as he failed to locate the car keys. Without them, we were trapped regardless of what might be waiting between us and the vehicle. "Keys," came the echo from the forest, but this time followed by, "Where are my keys this morning?" before hiking to the creek. "Check your backpack," Ben suggested. Trevor dumped the contents of his backpack onto the ground, scattering gear and supplies while searching for the keys. Wallet, phone, granola bars, first aid kit, but no keys. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking as he went through everything a second time. "They're not here," he said. "I know I had them when we got out of the car." "They're not here when we got out of the car," the voices repeated from multiple locations around the parking area. That's when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There were footprints in the gravel near the Honda Pilot. Fresh footprints that hadn't been there when we'd parked. Someone had been at our car while we were hiking. "Look at the ground around the car," I said, pointing toward the vehicle. The others saw it too. Clear impressions in the gravel, showing that someone had walked around the entire vehicle, examining it from every angle. The footprints were too large to belong to any of us, and the tread pattern didn't match any of our hiking boots. "Someone's been here," Jordan said. "Someone's been here examining the car while we were hiking," came the response from somewhere near the vehicle itself. We were trapped. Our transportation was 50 yards away, but someone or something had already discovered it and was potentially waiting for us to approach. The keys were missing, which meant that even if we reached the car safely, we might not be able to leave. "We need to think about this," I said. "Maybe we should head back to the trail and try to find other hikers who can help us." But even as I suggested it, I realized how foolish the idea was. We hadn't seen any other people all morning, and the trail system was remote enough that we might not encounter anyone for hours or even days. Tyler was getting worse. His shivering had become more violent, and he was having trouble following our conversation. "Tyler needs medical attention," Ben said. "We can't wait around here indefinitely." "We can't wait around here for Tyler, who needs medical attention," the voices responded. But this time, there was something different about them. They were clearer, more focused, as if whatever was speaking was getting better at combining our words into coherent statements. Trevor made the decision for all of us. "We're going for the car. All together, fast as we can. If someone's waiting there, at least we'll all be together to deal with it." He started toward the parking area before any of us could object, moving at a fast walk that quickly accelerated into a run. The rest of us followed, abandoning any attempt at stealth or caution. If something was going to happen, it was going to happen now. The 50 yards to the car felt like 500. Every step across the open gravel seemed to take forever, and I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us or see something emerge from the tree line. But we reached the Honda Pilot without incident, gathering around the driver's door while Trevor searched his pockets one more time for keys that weren't there. "Check inside the car," Drew suggested. "Maybe you left them in the ignition." Trevor cupped his hands against the driver's side window and peered inside. His expression changed from desperation to confusion to something approaching relief. "They're there," he said. "The keys are in the ignition." "That's impossible," Jordan said. "You locked the car when we got out." But Trevor was already trying the door handle, and it opened easily. The car was unlocked, the keys were in the ignition, and everything appeared normal, except for the fact that none of us remembered leaving it that way. "Get in," I said. "We'll figure it out later." We threw our gear into the back and piled into the vehicle, Tyler claiming the front passenger seat where he could get the most benefit from the heater. Trevor turned the key, and the engine started immediately. As we pulled out of the parking area and onto the road that would take us back to civilization, our own voices called after us from the forest. "Get in the car where the keys are waiting for Tyler, who needs help. We'll figure it out later when we get back to town. Check inside the car that's unlocked this morning." The sentences were becoming more sophisticated, more contextually appropriate. Whatever was in that forest was learning fast, and the thought of what it might be capable of by the time other hikers encountered it made me sick to my stomach. We drove in complete silence for the first 20 minutes, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what had just happened. Tyler gradually stopped shivering as the car's heater warmed him up, but his face remained pale, and he kept glancing nervously at the mirrors, as if expecting to see something following us. It wasn't until we reached the main highway that anyone spoke. "We need to report this," Ben said. "Other people hike that trail. They need to know there's something dangerous up there." "Report what exactly?" Drew asked. "That we heard voices in the forest? That something was copying the way we talk? Who's going to believe that?" It was a fair question. The story sounded insane even to us, and we had lived through it. Law enforcement would likely assume we had been pranked by other hikers, or that we had misinterpreted natural sounds due to paranoia and isolation. "What about the footprints around the car?" Jordan suggested. "And the missing keys that somehow ended up in the ignition?" Those were concrete, physical evidence that something unusual had occurred. But they could also be explained by human activity. Someone could have found Trevor's dropped keys and put them in the car as a good deed, or the footprints could have belonged to maintenance workers or other legitimate visitors to the area. "I'm calling the ranger station," Trevor decided, pulling out his phone now that we had cell service again. At minimum, they should know that people are having unusual experiences on that trail. He made the call, speaking to someone at the local Forest Service office and providing a carefully edited version of our experience. He mentioned hearing voices that seemed to be following us, finding evidence that someone had been at our vehicle, and feeling unsafe enough to cut our trip short. He avoided mentioning the voice mimicry, which was the most unbelievable part of our story. The ranger he spoke with was polite and professional, taking down our information and promising to have someone check the trail within the next few days. She mentioned that they occasionally received reports of unusual activity in remote areas, usually involving people who were under stress or inexperienced in wilderness settings. "She thinks we're city kids who got spooked by normal forest sounds," Trevor reported after ending the call. But I knew what we had experienced wasn't normal, and as the days passed, my certainty about that only increased. I found myself researching similar incidents online, looking for other reports of voice mimicry in wilderness areas. What I found was disturbing. There were scattered accounts going back decades of hikers and campers reporting voices that seemed to copy human speech patterns. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misunderstandings, but the consistency of the details across different times and locations was striking. People described the same progression we had experienced, first hearing indistinct voices, then perfect mimicry of their own speech, then increasingly sophisticated attempts to combine their words into new sentences. The most disturbing reports came from areas where search and rescue teams had been called to look for missing hikers. In several cases, other hikers had reported hearing the voices of the missing people calling for help from locations where no one was found. The missing hikers were sometimes located days later in completely different areas, with no memory of how they had gotten there. I shared my research with the others during a group video call, a week after our experience. None of us had been sleeping well, and we all admitted to feeling anxious and unsettled in ways that we couldn't fully explain. "So what do you think it was?" Tyler asked. He had recovered physically from his exposure to the cold creek water, but like the rest of us, he was struggling with the psychological impact of what we had encountered. "I think it was human," I said. "Someone with technology that could record and play back our voices with perfect accuracy. Someone who has been using that trail to target hikers." It was the most rational explanation I could come up with, though it didn't fully account for everything we had experienced. The speed with which our voices had been recorded and played back, the ability to combine our words into new sentences, the apparent coordination of sounds from multiple locations, all of these suggested technology more sophisticated than anything I knew to be available to civilians. "But why?" Ben asked. "What would be the point?" "Maybe to separate people from groups," Drew suggested. "If you can mimic someone's voice and make it sound like they're calling for help from a different location, you could potentially lure their friends away from safety." The implication was horrifying. If someone was using advanced voice mimicry technology to hunt hikers in remote areas, then other people were in immediate danger. Our escape might have been successful, but the next group to encounter this threat might not be so fortunate. "We need to do more than just report it to the Forest Service," I said. "We need to make sure this information gets to people who will take it seriously and investigate properly." Over the following weeks, we contacted local law enforcement, state police, and even the FBI field office in our region. Most of these contacts resulted in polite but dismissive responses. Without concrete evidence or a specific crime to investigate, there was little that official agencies could or would do based on our report alone. But we also reached out to hiking forums, local outdoor clubs, and social media groups focused on wilderness safety. Here, our warnings found a more receptive audience. Other hikers shared similar experiences, adding details that supported our account and filling in gaps in the pattern of incidents. A picture began to emerge of organized predatory activity targeting remote hiking areas throughout our region. The voice mimicry was just one technique being used. Other reports mentioned false trail markers, deliberately damaged bridges and trail infrastructure, and evidence of camps hidden in areas where no camping was supposed to occur. 6 months later, a joint task force of state and federal law enforcement arrested 3 individuals who had been operating an elaborate scheme to rob and kidnap hikers in remote wilderness areas. They had been using military-grade electronic surveillance equipment to monitor hikers' conversations and then employing sophisticated audio technology to play back recorded voices in order to separate people from their groups. When the details of their operation became public, our experience finally made complete sense. We had encountered the early stages of a hunting pattern that had successfully victimized at least a dozen other hikers over a period of several years. Our escape had been successful, not because we were particularly clever or brave, but because we had recognized the threat early enough to respond appropriately. The technology they had been using was indeed far more advanced than anything available to typical civilians, military surplus equipment obtained through black market channels and modified for their specific purposes. Their operation had been sophisticated enough to avoid detection for years, and it might have continued indefinitely if they hadn't eventually targeted a group that included an off-duty police officer who recognized the tactical nature of what they were experiencing. Looking back, I realize how fortunate we were. The voices in the forest that day were not supernatural or unexplainable. They were human predators using advanced technology to hunt other humans in locations where victims would be isolated and vulnerable. Our instinct to flee rather than investigate had literally saved our lives. The wilderness remains a place of beauty and recreation for millions of people, but it's also a place where human predators can operate with relative impunity. The incident taught me that the most dangerous creatures in the forest are not bears or wolves, but the humans who have learned to exploit our assumptions about safety and isolation. I still go fishing with my friends, but we're more cautious now about remote locations. We inform multiple people about our plans, carry reliable communication equipment, and most importantly, we trust our instincts when something feels wrong. The voices in the forest that day were a warning that we were fortunate enough to heed in time. The memory of hearing our own voices calling to us from the darkness between the trees will stay with me for the rest of my life, not because it was supernatural or mysterious, but because it was human intelligence turned toward predatory purposes, and because I now understand how easily it could have ended very differently for all of us. The drive up to our family cabin in March of 2023 should have been peaceful. I was 24 then, old enough to appreciate the silence that comes with leaving the city behind, but young enough to still feel excitement about a week away from everything. My mother drove while my 15-year-old nephew sat in the back seat with our German Shepherd, Ranger. The winding road through the Indiana hills seemed to stretch forever, each turn taking us deeper into the kind of wilderness that makes you remember how small you really are. The cabin sat perched on a ridge, overlooking miles of dense forest. My grandfather had built it in the 1970s, and though we'd modernized it over the years with better insulation and a new roof, it still maintained that rustic charm that made you feel disconnected from the modern world. As we pulled into the gravel driveway, I noticed how the trees seemed to lean in closer than I remembered from previous visits. The bare branches created a web of shadows that moved and shifted with even the slightest breeze. "Looks like we're the only ones crazy enough to be up here this early in the season," my mother commented as she turned off the engine. She was right. Most of the neighboring cabins appeared empty, their windows dark, and their driveways unplowed from the last snowfall. The isolation felt complete and absolute. Ranger immediately began pacing once we let him out of the car, his nose working overtime as he processed all the scents of the forest. I watched him carefully, noting how his ears kept swiveling toward the tray line, as if he were listening for something specific. Dogs have always been more attuned to their surroundings than humans, and his behavior struck me as unusually alert for a place he'd visited many times before. By evening, we had settled into our familiar routines. The temperature had dropped significantly once the sun disappeared behind the hills, and the weather forecast promised several days of cold rain, perfect conditions for staying indoors and enjoying the massive stone fireplace that dominated the cabin's main room. I built a fire while my mother unpacked groceries, and my nephew set up his gaming system, though the spotty internet connection made it more decorative than functional. The wood crackled and popped as the flames took hold, filling the room with dancing shadows and the comforting scent of burning oak. We pulled our chairs close to the hearth, and my mother produced her phone to find something to read aloud. She'd always been the storyteller in our family, and scary stories by firelight had become something of a tradition during our cabin visits. "Here's one that sounds appropriately creepy," she announced, scrolling through her screen. "It's about a family who keeps hearing things outside their remote cabin." The irony wasn't lost on me, but I settled back in my chair anyway, letting the warmth seep into my bones and my eyes drift shut. The fire provided just enough background noise to make everything feel secure and contained. For a moment, I felt that perfect sense of peace that comes from being completely disconnected from the outside world. That's when we heard it. The sound cut through the night air like a blade through silk. It wasn't quite a scream, and not exactly a howl, but something in between that made every muscle in my body tense. The sound seemed to come from directly behind the cabin, maybe 50 yards into the tray line. It lasted for maybe 3 seconds, rising in pitch before cutting off abruptly. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Did you hear that?" My mother paused in her reading and looked up. "Hear what, honey?" "That sound, that howling or screaming or whatever it was." She glanced toward the windows, then back at me with a slightly confused expression. I didn't hear anything unusual. Maybe it was just the wind in the trees. But my nephew had heard something too. I could tell by the way he'd gone completely still, his game controller forgotten in his lap. His eyes were fixed on the back door, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. "You heard it, didn't you?" I asked him directly. He looked between my mother and me, then shrugged. "I thought I heard something, but Mom's probably right. Probably just the wind." The casualness of their responses felt wrong. The sound had been too distinct, too purposeful to dismiss so easily, and there had been no wind that evening. The air outside was still and heavy with approaching weather. The next morning brought the promised rain, and with it, a strange atmosphere that seemed to settle over the cabin like a heavy blanket. My mother made coffee and prepared breakfast as if nothing had happened. chatting about her plans to catch up on reading and maybe work on a jigsaw puzzle she'd brought along. My nephew retreated to his room with a stack of books, apparently resigned to a few days without reliable internet. I found myself drawn to the windows, studying the forest that surrounded us on 3 sides. In daylight, the trees looked innocent enough, just bare hardwoods and evergreens stretching as far as I could see. But something felt different about the way the shadows fell between the trunks, and I caught myself scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. "You're awfully quiet today," my mother observed as she joined me at the kitchen window. "Just thinking about that sound last night." She sighed and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Sweetie, I know being up here can make your imagination run wild, but there are lots of perfectly normal explanations for strange noises in the woods. Could have been a tree falling, or maybe a deer caught in some brush." Her explanation felt rehearsed, too convenient, and it didn't account for the fact that both my nephew and I had reacted to the sound before she'd even acknowledged hearing anything at all. That afternoon, while my mother napped and my nephew read in his room, I decided to take Ranger for a walk around the perimeter of our property. The rain had stopped temporarily, leaving everything dripping and fragrant with the smell of wet earth and decomposing leaves. Ranger seemed eager to explore, but I noticed he kept pulling toward the back of the cabin, toward the area where the sound had originated the night before. "What is it, boy?" I asked him, letting him lead me to the edge of the tree line. He stopped abruptly about 20 feet from the closest trees and began that low rumbling growl that dogs make when they sense a threat. His hackles rose along his neck and back, and his body went rigid with attention. I followed his gaze into the shadows between the trees, but saw nothing unusual. "What's out there?" Ranger's growl intensified, and he took a step backward, pressing against my legs as if to push me away from whatever had captured his attention. I'd never seen him react this way to anything before. He was typically a confident, fearless dog who would investigate any new scent or sound with enthusiasm. We stayed there for several minutes, both of us staring into the forest, before I finally decided to retreat to the cabin. As we walked back, I could feel Ranger's tension in the way he kept looking over his shoulder, and I found myself doing the same thing. The second night brought more rain and an early darkness that seemed to press against the cabin windows like something alive. We'd settled into our evening routine: fire, comfortable chairs, and my mother's storytelling, but I found it impossible to relax. Every sound from outside made me jump, and I noticed that Ranger had positioned himself directly in front of the back door, as if standing guard. "You're making me nervous with all that fidgeting," my mother said gently. "Why don't you try to enjoy yourself? We're here to relax, remember?" I wanted to tell her that relaxation seemed impossible when every instinct I possessed was screaming that something was wrong, but I also didn't want to ruin the vacation for everyone else. So I forced myself to sit still and listen to her read from a collection of ghost stories she'd downloaded. The story she chose was about a family trapped in their home during a blizzard, hearing voices calling to them from outside. The parallels to our situation weren't lost on me, and I wondered if she'd selected it intentionally. As her voice rose and fell with the narrative, I found myself listening not just to her words, but to everything else as well: the fire crackling, the rain drumming on the roof, Ranger's occasional shifts in position. That's when the scratching started. It was so faint at first that I thought I might be imagining it. A soft, rhythmic scraping sound that seemed to come from directly above us, as if something were moving across the roof with deliberate slowness. I tilted my head, straining to isolate the sound from the rain and wind. "Mom, do you hear that scratching?" She paused in her reading and listened for a moment. "I hear the rain on the roof. That's probably all it is." But the sound was too regular, too purposeful to be random precipitation. It moved from one side of the roof to the other, paused, then reversed direction. Whatever was making the sound was large enough to create distinct footfalls on the wooden shingles. My nephew looked up from his book with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was fear there, certainly, but also something that looked almost like resignation, as if he'd been expecting this. "It's getting louder," I whispered. The scratching had indeed intensified, and now it was accompanied by a different sound, a low, throaty breathing that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Ranger rose to his feet and began pacing between the back door and the front windows, whining softly under his breath. "There's something on the roof," I said with more urgency, "and Ranger can hear it too. Look at him." My mother set down her phone and studied our dog for a moment. Even she couldn't deny his obvious distress. But instead of acknowledging the sounds that were growing more pronounced by the minute, she stood up and walked to the thermostat. "Maybe we should turn up the heat. Sometimes the heating system makes odd noises when it's working hard." Her explanation was absurd. We'd been coming to this cabin for years, and I knew every sound the heating system made. This was something else entirely, something that was moving around on our roof with increasing boldness. The scratching continued for another 10 minutes before gradually fading away, leaving behind only the sound of rain and my own racing heartbeat. I barely slept that night. Every small sound from outside had me sitting up in bed, straining to listen for the return of whatever had been moving around above us. Ranger had planted himself on the floor beside my bed and remained there until morning, occasionally lifting his head to listen before settling back down with a frustrated sigh. When dawn finally arrived, I was the first one awake. I dressed quickly and stepped outside to examine the roof and the area around the cabin. What I found made my stomach turn cold with dread. The soft earth around the cabin was marked with tracks, not animal tracks, but something else entirely. They were roughly the size and shape of human footprints, but elongated and deeper than any normal person could make. The impression suggested something heavy moving on two legs, circling the cabin repeatedly throughout the night. Even more disturbing were the marks on the cabin itself. Long scratches had been gouged into the wooden siding near the back door, and several of the roof shingles showed signs of damage consistent with something large moving across them. The evidence was unmistakable. Something had been prowling around our cabin in the darkness. I called Ranger outside to see how he would react to the tracks. His response was immediate and dramatic. His hackles rose, he began that low growling again, and he refused to approach the marked areas despite my encouragement. Whatever scent lingered in those footprints was enough to terrify a 90-pound German shepherd. "Find anything interesting?" Well, I spun around to find my mother standing in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, looking remarkably calm for someone whose vacation cabin had been vandalized during the night. "Look at these tracks," I said, pointing to the clearest impressions in the mud. "And look at the scratches on the siding. Something was here last night, something big." She stepped closer and examined the evidence with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Those are unusual," she admitted. "Maybe we should call the local sheriff's office and report some vandalism." Her suggestion seemed reasonable on the surface, but something about her tone felt wrong. She was looking at clear evidence that something dangerous had been stalking around our isolated cabin, and her primary concern was filing a police report. "Mom, I don't think this was vandalism. I think there's something living in these woods, something that's been watching us." She sipped her coffee and gazed out at the forest with an expression I couldn't interpret. "Honey, I know this is frightening, but we can't let our imaginations get the better of us. There are reasonable explanations for everything we've seen and heard." But, as she spoke, I noticed her eyes weren't focused on the trees. Instead, she seemed to be studying something specific in the distance, as if she were looking for something she expected to find there. That evening, I decided I couldn't continue pretending that everything was normal. The physical evidence, combined with the sounds we'd been hearing and Ranger's obvious distress, painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Something was stalking us, and my family's refusal to acknowledge the danger was becoming more disturbing than the threat itself. "We need to talk," I announced, as we gathered around the fire for our third night at the cabin. My mother looked up from her book with a patient smile. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" "This whole situation, the sounds, the tracks, the way you and David keep pretending nothing's happening. I need to understand what's going on." My nephew David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but didn't meet my eyes. My mother set down her book and gave me her full attention. "I'm not pretending anything," she said carefully. "I've acknowledged that we've heard some unusual sounds and seen some strange tracks, but I'm also trying to keep things in perspective. We're in the middle of the wilderness. Strange things happen in places like this." "But that's just it," I pressed. "You're not acting like someone who's concerned about strange things happening. You're acting like someone who knows exactly what's going on and doesn't want to talk about it." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. David continued to stare at his hands, while my mother seemed to be choosing her words very carefully. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked, finally. "I'm suggesting that both of you heard the same things I did, and both of you saw the same evidence I showed you this morning. But instead of being concerned or frightened or even curious, you're both acting like this is somehow normal or expected." Another long silence. Then David finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should tell him." My mother's head snapped toward him with an expression of sharp warning. "David." "Tell me what?" I demanded. David looked at my mother, then back at me. "It's just, this isn't the first time this has happened." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean, not the first time?" My mother stood up abruptly and walked to the window, her back to both of us. "David, that's enough." But David continued anyway, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Last summer when we were here, and the time before that, always the same sounds, always the same tracks. Mom made me promise not to tell you because she said it would ruin the cabin for you." I felt the world tilt slightly as the implications of his words sank in. "You've been coming here knowing that something dangerous stalks around the cabin at night, and you never told me." My mother turned back to face me, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I saw real fear in her eyes. "It's not dangerous," she said quietly. "It's never tried to get inside. It's never hurt anyone. It just watches." "How do you know it's not dangerous? How can you possibly know that?" She hesitated, then sank back into her chair with a heavy sigh. "Because your grandfather told me about it before he died. He said it had been coming around for years, probably decades. He called it the Watcher, said it was part of these woods, something that had always been here." The revelation left me speechless. My grandfather, who had built this cabin and spent countless nights here alone, had known about this thing and never warned any of us. "He said it was curious about people, but never harmful," my mother continued, "like it was trying to understand us, but from a distance. He actually found it somewhat comforting in his later years, knowing something was keeping watch over the place." Armed with the truth, I found myself in an impossible position. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was lurking in those woods. But another part of me, the part that had inherited my grandfather's curiosity and stubbornness, wanted to stay and confront this mystery directly. My mother and David seemed relieved to have finally shared their secret, but they also made it clear that they expected me to accept the situation as they had. The Watcher was simply part of the cabin experience, something to be endured rather than understood or confronted. But I couldn't accept that level of passive resignation. If something had been observing our family for years, I wanted to know what it was and what it wanted. That night, I made a decision that probably wasn't very wise. Instead of hiding inside the cabin and waiting for the sounds to begin, I decided to position myself where I could observe the Watcher in return. I dressed in dark clothes, armed myself with a powerful flashlight and my grandfather's old hunting rifle, and slipped out the back door while my mother and David were settling in for the evening. I found a position about 50 yards from the cabin, behind a fallen log that provided both concealment and a clear view of the building. The night was cold and damp, with a thin mist rising from the forest floor that made everything beyond 20 feet look ghostly and indistinct. For the first hour, nothing happened. I began to wonder if my presence outside had somehow scared off whatever usually visited us. But then I heard it, the soft scraping sound of something moving through the underbrush, approaching from deeper in the forest. The sounds grew closer, accompanied by that strange breathing I'd heard before. I gripped the rifle tighter and tried to control my own breathing as the noises circled around to the back of the cabin. Through the mist, I could make out a dark shape moving between the trees, taller than any animal, but moving with an odd hunched gait that didn't look entirely human either. The shape paused at the edge of the clearing, and I realized it was studying the cabin just as I was studying it. For several minutes, we formed a strange triangle, the watcher observing the cabin, me observing the watcher, and my family inside, unaware that their secret was finally being exposed. Then the shape began to move again, circling the cabin with that same deliberate pattern I'd tracked in the mud. As it passed through a gap in the mist, I got my first clear look at what had been stalking us. It was tall at least 7 feet, and covered in dark matted hair that glistened with moisture from the mist. Its limbs were elongated and moved with an unsettling fluidity that suggested joints that bent in ways human joints shouldn't. But it was the face that made me grip the rifle with trembling hands. The features were almost human, but stretched and distorted as if someone had taken a person's face and pulled it like taffy. The eyes were large and dark, and they moved with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. As I watched in frozen fascination, the creature completed its circuit of the cabin, and then did something that made my heart stop. It turned and looked directly at me. We stared at each other across the misty clearing for what felt like an eternity. Its dark eyes held mine with an intensity that spoke of recognition and perhaps even amusement. It had known I was there all along. Then it did something even more unsettling. It raised one elongated hand and waved. The wave was unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably intelligent, and unmistakably friendly. In that single gesture, the creature transformed in my mind from a source of terror to something far more complex and mysterious. It wasn't hunting us or threatening us, it was greeting me. I sat there for another 20 minutes, watching as the creature continued its patrol around the cabin, occasionally glancing in my direction as if to make sure I was still there. Its movements were careful and quiet, designed not to disturb the occupants inside. It really was just watching, just as my grandfather had said. Eventually, the creature melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and a completely transformed understanding of our situation. I waited another hour before returning to the cabin, where I found my mother sitting by the dying fire, clearly waiting for me. "You went out there, didn't you?" she said without looking up. "Yes." "And you saw it?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Your grandfather did the same thing his first summer here, said he couldn't stand not knowing what was sharing the woods with him." I settled into the chair across from her, still processing what I'd experienced. "What is it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Your grandfather had theories, but they were just guesses. He thought maybe it was something that had always lived in these hills, something that predated human settlement. He said the local Native American tribes had stories about forest watchers, guardians that kept track of who entered their territory." It waved at me. It waved at me, too. That made her smile for the first time since we'd arrived. "It waved at your grandfather, too. He said that was when he realized it wasn't something to be feared, just something to be respected." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the normal sounds of the forest settling into sleep. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me since David's revelation. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I was afraid you'd want to leave and never come back. This place has been in our family for 50 years. Your grandfather loved it here, and I love it here, and I want you to love it too. I thought if I could just get you used to the idea gradually." "By lying to me about what I was hearing and seeing?" She winced. "By protecting you from something you weren't ready to understand. But you're ready now, aren't you?" I considered the question seriously. The fear was still there. I doubted I'd ever be completely comfortable knowing that something was watching us from the darkness. But it was tempered now by curiosity and, strangely enough, a sense of connection to something larger than myself. "I think so," I said finally. We packed up and left the next morning, but not because of fear or disgust. Our week was simply over, and we all had responsibilities waiting for us in the real world. As we loaded the car, I found myself looking forward to our next visit rather than dreading it. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the tense silence we'd maintained for most of the week. David seemed relieved to have the family secret finally out in the open, and my mother appeared genuinely happy that I'd accepted the truth about our unusual cabin guest. As we reached the bottom of the hill and the cabin disappeared behind the trees, I realized that my relationship with that place had been fundamentally changed. It was no longer just a family retreat. It was a bridge between our world and something ancient and mysterious that most people would never have the privilege to encounter. I'm already planning our next visit, and this time, I think I'll be ready to wave back.